Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Digging Deeper. It's August 22nd, 2022. Definitely going to have one of those days where my throat is really dry. But first of all, you may hear some crazy noises in the background. There's road work going on outside, so there's that. Secondly, if you haven't yet, please be sure to subscribe to the page, like this video, and hit the bell to continue getting notifications. So typically on Digging Deeper, I like to dive into three things: religion, politics, and labor. All right. So today, I kind of want to dig deeper into something very specific. Today we're going to be talking about this push to ban books and ideas and knowledge from certain segments of the population, specifically when it comes to children and libraries and that sort of thing. You may have seen on the news recently that there's been a lot of that. A lot of people saying, you know, this has CRT or this supports gays. There's been libraries shut down over it. And currently in Florida, there is a big push by Governor DeSantis to take books out of circulation in the schools that support wokeness, as he puts it. So let's go ahead and look at one of the articles about that. Actually, we're going to look at two articles about it, just give some quick quotes. I'm going to do my very best to not read these monotone because I know for a fact that is one of my hang-ups. So, first of all, a school in Florida could not accept a donation of dictionaries amid a new state law aimed at combating wokeness in classrooms. The Venice Suncoast Rotary Club was prepared to give its annual donation of dictionaries to Sarasota County schools ahead of the new school year, but the district stopped all donations and purchases of books for school libraries until at least next year. This came after House Bill 1467 took effect in July. The law requires school districts to have all reading and instructional materials reviewed by a district employee with a valid educational media specialist certificate. That is in quotes in this article. I'm not sure that, I haven't done too much research into that. I'm not sure what exactly getting that certificate entails. I'm sure there's a training class where they show you what wokeness looks like. But Sarasota County Schools does not currently have a certified media specialist working in its schools and therefore has put a temporary freeze on book purchases and donations until January 2023, the district said. This allows time for hiring and working through existing materials. It also allows time for the Florida Department of Education to provide rules and the district's curriculum team to provide interpretation and additional guidance on the legislation. So it looks like the rules aren't very specific. We're also going to talk really quick about something that happened with some math books. So, racial prejudice and emotional learning are just two of the many prohibited topics cited as impermissible by the Florida Department of Education, which has announced why it banned 41% of new math textbooks. Citing a wave of requests for examples of the problematic elements that led to the Department of Education to ban those math books, the department issued a list of examples that presented no conflict in being shared with the public. Under an exercise supposed to be teaching students about polynomials, a kind of mathematical expression, the first few words introducing the teacher's teaching instructions are highlighted as guilty of mentioning the Florida Department of Education's prohibited topics. "What, me, racist?" read the instructions, before mentioning that the students will be working with a mathematical model measuring bias that has been used by over 2 million people to test their racial prejudice through the implicit association test. Another example provided by the Florida Department of Education mentions that the implicit association test, again, this time showing two graphs, providing the results for racial prejudice by age and by political identification. Two other examples provided cite emotional learning, including build proficiency with social awareness and practice with empathizing with classmates among the students as proof of the math textbook's alleged attempts at indoctrinating pupils, as the Department of Education said. One example talks of building students' agency, focusing on students' social and emotional learning. So, those ideas of social and emotional learning are now prohibited by Florida's wokeness law. Um, I can see where people have an issue with that, in the sense that they don't want their children to be taught specific things. It is always strange to me that people want to restrict the information that is taught to their children. A broad scope of knowledge is definitely the kind of thing that every kid needs to come out of their education with. Yeah, and unfortunately, most kids that will only go to high school because of a situation in the United States where college is extremely cost prohibitive. Um, but does sheltering your kids from just general information or general ideas really help or hinder the student? And where does that notion of, regulating how kids learn about society and empathy and things like that come from? It's a really interesting topic to dig into because there's definitely arguments to be made on both sides. A lot of people don't want their kids to experience anything that makes them feel uncomfortable in school, and I think people on both sides of the aisle would definitely be fine with that. I do also know that kids tend to be perfectly comfortable, and it's actually the parents that become uncomfortable with the subject because they have their own biases in either direction, liberal or conservative, that lean them into this idea that I don't want my kids to be taught this specific thing. For a liberal, that might be they don't want their child to be taught the lost cause doctrines, or tenets of the South, where you're looking at a South that is, not a failed military power and a defeated nation, but is, a cause that just didn't succeed and will rise again, like that sort of idea. Or from the conservative side, the notion that, the perceived notion that white people should feel guilty for the plight of black people. Those are tricky waters to navigate, especially in a public school setting, because in the public school, the idea is to create this broad base of knowledge and to create intelligent and rational human beings that can move forward into the working world and do their jobs effectively. Because the reality is that education in the United States is designed significantly less for actual, edification of the student, and more designed as a pathway into the job force. Instead of finding middle ground, we find that both sides are keen to do one of two things: either directly insert exactly what they believe the only right answer is into curriculum, or to outright ban ideas. Right now, we're seeing a heavy push for the banning of ideas. I have looked at a lot of the information that is considered offensive, critical race theory, and a lot of it is very subtle looks at ideas like implicit bias, at empathy, at social consciousness, and understanding how we have to move through the world as people. So, as a consequence, I think it's really easy for either side to latch on to an idea and to say, this part's evil, this part's right, only my part deserves to be in a book, nothing else. I think, and again, that's why this is an opinion show, I think that both sides are wrong in that. To force your opinion into something as a fact never works. And to ban something because you dislike it, because you find it icky, also doesn't work. Prohibition never works. Let's start with that. Let's look at alcohol prohibition. All it did was create gangs that, trafficked alcohol, right? We look at drug prohibition. All it does is create gangs that traffic drugs. Well, books are a little less illicit than than drugs and alcohol, but when you ban books, you find that it's very easy to still obtain those books. There's these things called used bookstores and libraries, and even when they're banned from libraries, most librarians will still keep a copy. Most schools will still find ways to keep those books in circulation, even if it's on the down low. And the reality is, when it comes to banning books and banning ideas, the public, the standard American, as it were, is very much against that. So in a CBS News poll asking, should books ever be banned for, and we're going to go through 4 things, the results are very direct. Like, it's not like a 60-40 based on political party. It is like vast majorities. So should a book ever be banned for criticizing U.S. history? 83% say no. Should a book ever be banned for political ideas you agree with? 85% say no. Should it be banned for depicting slavery? 87% say it should be no. And then discussing race, 87% say it should be no. Do we think teaching about race in America makes students understand what others went through? 68% of people said yes. More racially tolerant today? 42% of people said yes. Feel guilty about past generations? Only 23% of people say that reading about those things makes them feel guilty. And only 16% of people say it makes people less racially tolerant today. Public opinion is on the side of information. I think the vast majority of people prefer to have more information instead of less information. It's difficult to make a decision in a vacuum, and it's difficult to form an opinion when you don't. That's not correct. It's really easy to create an opinion out of whole cloth, but to create a legitimate opinion that people will actually listen to and reason with and have conversations about is very difficult to do without knowing both sides of the equation. As soon as you're creating your ideas based on just like this single focus, single track mind, people will immediately dismiss you. Seeing that a lot in our comments. We posted a meme that was very provocative, for lack of a better term, and we see a lot of people coming in to effectively defend the notion that, I don't know how to word this exactly. We're having a lot of people come in and they are upset because there is an image of a Klansman hung with some people taking a picture of it. So when creating the art, which I am the person responsible for that art, I was thinking back to the pictures of, the postbellum South where, a lynching would occur and it was considered like a community event. And you have lots of pictures of men lynched and groups of Klansmen and just general population taking pictures of themselves with it, as though it's some kind of victory. It's a party, it's a picnic, it's something that they've done. In our day and age, if the shoe was put on the other foot, the response would probably be very similar. People would see the hanging and people would pull out their phones and take a picture of it, take selfies with it, celebrate the murder. Both sides of that equation are disgusting, right? But if you don't call attention to both sides of the equation, it's very difficult for anybody to really see or feel empathy. If you see yourself in a position of like suppression or oppression, in that image, you know, you see the hung Klansmen and you equate that to like white culture. It says a lot, right? It says a lot about how you feel about white culture. It says a lot about how you feel about art. It says a lot about how you feel about history. And where do a lot of those ideas come from? Like this notion that, you know, white culture needs to be preserved, or that Southern culture is somehow not steeped in like racist ideologies. You know, that the South attempting to remove itself from the United States was not born out of the desire to maintain slavery, that it was a, you know, a states' rights issue, that it was something that was important to the South but not important to the North, and so as a consequence, you know, the North didn't approve of it. Not necessarily true. The political spectrum went both ways on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. There are abolitionists in the South. There were slavery proponents in the North. Like, it was a very heated argument, right? And this notion that the Civil War and the post-Civil War era is just, you know, it happened, it's okay, and that it didn't create a through line to today is a mistake. So let's talk a little bit about rewriting history. So most of the time we talk about how history is written by the victors, right? But there is a very strong sense of what's called the lost cause of the South, right? And in the, you know, early 1900s through the 1930s and the 1960s, there is something that's called a mint julep portrayal of the South. So let's talk about this interview from Shara Bowen. She is an education professor at Georgia State University. And when asked, how did these mint julep histories come about? She said, after the Civil War, from the 1870s through the 1910s, public schooling became more widespread in the South, and Confederate sympathizers wanted to ensure that their children received an appropriate, quote, appropriate education on Southern history and culture. To that end, Southern states developed statewide adoption policies for textbooks. This allowed the state textbook committees to control content by demanding changes or threatening to cancel book contracts unless the publishers acquiesced. Today, most of the states with statewide textbook adoption policies are still in the South. To keep their business, Northern publishers began adapting history books to appease Southerners, essentially publishing a separate version of Civil War histories for those states. These editions reinforced a lost cause narrative for Southern audiences. For example, they depicted enslaved people as happy and content. Officials even counted the textbook lines to make sure authors had mentioned Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee as many times as Abraham Lincoln or Ulysses S. Grant. What our research shows is that as time progressed, increasingly the Southern version of events began infiltrating Northern textbooks as well. As the Southern and Northern narratives merged, Southerners really influenced how and what Americans learned about the Civil War, no matter where they lived. When asked, can you give an example of how the Southern perspective seeped into Northern textbooks? One example is how the books depicted Abraham Lincoln's assassination by John Wilkes Booth in 1865. In the 1890s, mint julep textbooks either ignored the assassination or distanced Southerners from Booth's actions by de-emphasizing his accomplices. Meanwhile, Northern authors linked Booth to a broader conspiracy plot, thus implicating many Southerners in Lincoln's murder. By the 1930s, though, Northern authors had begun mimicking their Southern counterparts, ignoring the conspiracy, and focusing more on Booth's mental state, dismissing him as an insane actor. So, we see that today, right? We see this notion that John Wilkes Booth was this lone gunman, right? But there was actually a vast conspiracy in the attempt to assassinate President Lincoln, right? just like slavery was one of the key components of the South seceding from the Union, right? When we look at the Cornerstone speech, they talk very specifically about how the cause of the Confederacy is the cause to maintain slavery. So, this redoing of history, this taking it back and attempting to change how history works and how history is taught, has created a through line into our education system and the way that we ban books now. First thing it's done, it creates an us versus them narrative, right? So we're intended to be a union. We're intended to be a nation that is unified. You can see in today's society that that's not true, right? At the end of the Civil War, the people that perpetuated the Civil War, the leadership that was part of the Confederacy, was reassumed back into the Union, right? Those same people that drove the Confederacy then became the politicians in the South, right? They weren't excluded from the political conversation. They weren't removed, even though they were a defeated nation, even though they had been, I don't even want to say resoundingly defeated, because it was a messy affair on both sides. But those voices were allowed. You know, we value speech. We value freedom of expression, freedom of thought. But while those voices were being allowed back into the conversation, the voice of the victorious Union was suppressing itself in an effort to say, let's get over this, right? Let's move on. But we didn't move on, right? These lost cause doctrines continued, where, as it says here, the claims that the causes of the Confederate States during the American Civil War was just rhetoric and not centered on slavery, right? They re-emphasize this traditional culture of honor and chivalry in the antebellum South. They talk about how enslaved people were treated just fine. And, you know, the evidence they give of that is, you know, things like John Brown, when he attacked Harper's Ferry, like, slaves didn't rush to you know, join the war, as it were. You know, how slaves are intended to get news, you know, in a slave state is totally beyond me. Always seemed like the major flaw in John Brown's moves. They also are very focused on states' rights, right? That they say the real cause of the Civil War is that states that wanted to maintain slavery deserve the right to say, as a state, we decide this, right? And that's the main reason they wanted to secede, is because of state autonomy. We see that happening today, right? We know that that's returning. You can look at it in Roe versus Wade. It's probably going to come up in other court cases. Other court cases like this next year with the Supreme Court. In one rare step, they actually insisted that the federal government regulate guns in the sense that they can't regulate guns. I don't know, it's a very confusing Supreme Court sometimes, where states don't have the responsibility required to regulate guns, but they do have the responsibility required to regulate abortion or gerrymandering, that sort of thing. It's just a weird way to be, but it's aside the point. So those little keywords of, you know, states' rights, of, you know, chivalrous, honor, respectability, you know, all of those things are things that we see today in the Western civilization cult, in the you know, movements of governors like DeSantis, or like in Texas, where they're like trying to ban ideas because they butt up against this notion that there's, you know, bad things in the past. There's nastiness at the hands of, you know, Southern leaders in the past. By not immediately jumping into the fray and saying, this particular notion is wrong, and these are the reasons why we actually fought the war. The North effectively conceded victory to the Southern idea in a lot of ways. You can see that reflected in Jim Crow laws, in, segregationist laws. They're saying, you're right, you do have states' rights, and we're going to allow you to continue to oppress people in the name of your state's laws without any kind of recourse. And it wasn't until the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and we see those steps taken with the Voting Rights Act, which since has been completely defanged by the Supreme Court. But it wasn't until the 50s and 60s with the Civil Rights Act that we see people really double down on that, right? Most of the Confederate memorials that we have seen going down were put up by groups like the Daughters of the Confederacy in the 50s and 60s as a way to reassert the dominance that the South, that the Confederacy was not about slavery, but it was about honor, it was about culture, it was about respect, it was about states' rights. It wasn't about, how dare you say that we were racist? That was just how people were back then, that sort of thing. The reality is that the Civil War was fought for the right to have slaves. The South was afraid of not being able to be the economic powerhouse that they needed to be as an agricultural system, right? Because the North was beginning to dominate economically under an industrial system, right? Without chattel slavery, right? Without free labor, the South was looking at distinct economic decline. And the way that they maintained that was through wage slavery, was through sharecropping and that sort of system. To say, yeah, you're free now and this is your house, but you have to pay me for the house and you have to work this land and you pay me with what you got from the land for all of your things. And at the end of the day, you probably end up owing me money again so that you can't move on. The move from chattel slavery to wage slavery really didn't change anything for, the destitute in the South, black or white, right? As a matter of fact, it probably turned more white people into effective slaves than it converted black people into freemen. More impoverished people were drastically affected by the North's refusal to truly stand on a moral high ground. This one moment where they could say, no, people deserve fair wages, period. People deserve freedom, period. These systems that are just analogs for slavery cannot be used. So why doesn't the North do that? Because they're afraid of losing their economic power as well. The industrialization of the North was driven by the agrarian nature of the South, right? The North would send goods to the South would send raw materials to the North. Without that combination of things, the economic powerhouse of the United States doesn't survive the Civil War, right? It becomes two countries that are working against each other instead of with each other, right? So politicians deemed that it was important to allow these ideas to continue, for the South to effectively lick their wounds and walk away from the war and say, our bad. We'll just find a new way to manage our slaves that looks like everyday work. It's interesting seeing the through line. So even after the Civil Rights Act, you still have sharecroppers in the South. You still have people that are beholden to a plantation owner. You still have this notion that somehow the impoverished farmer who is working for the wealthy landowner is inferior, right? Too much of what we have going on in our country right now is intended to divide and conquer. After the Civil War, as the South was creating the narrative of the lost cause, and as the North was conceding that that narrative could be taught, you see a rise of wealthy people saying, well, we can use this to our advantage on both sides. And it creates an intentional separation between white and black people who are impoverished. That somehow the Southern gentleman, the crusading, chivalric, heroic Southern man is not only always white, but in spite of their poverty, always the Southern hero, right? When really they have a lot more in common with the black sharecropper, because they're just a white sharecropper. By creating this perceived division, by allowing the narrative that the South wasn't fighting, in favor of slavery, they were fighting in favor of states' rights and the honor of the white man, they create this split where the plantation owner still sitting pretty and everyone beneath him is still effectively working for free. But now he can count white people amongst his slaves. And those white people will self-police the rest of the sharecroppers because they're on the same side. They never get past poverty level. They never get past their oppression. But they feel like victors. They feel as though they have been put in a place of power. They have been given the concepts and the tools and the language to say, this wasn't about slavery, it was about my rights. And I have my rights, so really, we may have militarily lost, but I won. Because I have the ability now to say this, do this, act this way. Going into the 50s and 60s, you see as, black people are really starting to balk against that. The civil rights movement starts. This notion that wage slavery is somehow different than chattel slavery is completely demolished, right? Especially by people like Martin Luther King Jr., who was significantly more interested in raising the stakes when it came to the economic divide in the United States. He wanted black people to have the right to vote. And he wanted black people to have the right to vote so that they could begin to vote in their best interest to wrest themselves away from an economic design that was intended to subjugate them. And not just subjugate them, but subjugate everybody else into, you are the workers and somebody else makes the money, right? Dig deeper into Martin Luther King Jr., okay? It's important to see that his notions on labor and economics are what truly drove his desire to see civil rights. Because he didn't want to see just equity for black people. He wanted to see equity for poor people. Because the reality is there's so much more in common between me, Latino, not very wealthy, a black person who is not very wealthy, and a white person who is not very wealthy than anyone of any race that makes $1 billion a year, that can afford to shoot themselves into space, that can afford to call in sick to being shot into space. Did you know that? There was a guy that paid millions of dollars to be shot into space on the same ship as Jeff Bezos, and he canceled last minute because something else came up. Like, can you imagine that amount of money disappearing just 'cause, and being okay with that? It's baffling. So here we have the governors that want to ban ideas in books, and we have politicians and school boards that want to include ideas in books, right? And neither of them is really coming to terms with the fact that those ideas are all important. Understanding the full breadth of where people are coming from, of understanding that this racist person, like, let's go to our example of the hanging Klans member in a fictional image. The Klansman feels that he's superior because he's been taught that somehow his race is superior to anyone else's. But that Klansman, especially in the 50s and 60s when the civil rights movement was happening, was probably at the exact same economic standing as the person that he was attacking. Like, you read about the cross burning in the neighborhood or the cross burning on the farm. Like, those are happening within a community, right? Like, it's a group of Klansmen from the community attacking another community member, right? Like, the Klansmen aren't going and burning a cross at the rich person's lawn. It's another poor person, right? You're not seeing activity where the underclass, the people that are really being subjugated throughout their races, are attempting to dismantle the wealthy class, right? If we don't understand where that person is coming from, how can we ever have that conversation with them? How can we ever move into a space where we're able to actually create some kind of closure? Because there is no closure to the Civil War. We may have won it as the Union, right, and forced the states to remain part of the Union, but the ideas were allowed to perpetuate, right? And instead of looking at those ideas that were built in actual fiction, instead of looking at those ideas and saying, okay, there's really no basis for these things, and we need to remove them because of their fictionalization within the classroom. Instead, they were perpetuated, and perpetuated to an extent that I'm sure you've heard the statement, the War of Northern Aggression, right? They seceded from the Union took them back. That was it. That's what the war was. The reasoning behind the war, the South wanted to continue slavery, and the North wanted to not lose the economic powerhouse of the South. Right? Neither of them was fighting against slavery. Neither of them really was interested in the effect that this war would have on the population. You can see that just through thousands of people that died during that war. And now it's being drummed up again, this notion that the only solution is for us to fight each other in combat. There's a more effective solution that results in less death, that involves us reimagining what government looks like. There's room for every voice, right? What there's not room for is factless opinion, right? The notion that white people are superior to black people. It's a fiction, right? The notion that the only people that have ever been oppressed in this country are black is a fiction. The notion that Asian people have it easier because they're different somehow as a minority in the United States, that's a fiction. The notion that immigrants come here to steal jobs from natural born Americans, that's a fiction, right? And they're all fictions born not in our race, not in our opinions, but they're born in the ability to keep people from creating a unified whole. Because if, as a people, we actively engage in democracy, we actively engage with each other, we actively try to find actual solutions, and then force politicians to live by those solutions, then how much different does the world work? Do you really think it's fair they make $12 an hour while Jeff Bezos makes millions a minute? What is Bezos doing right now that makes Amazon work? Right? Not what is he doing right now to guide and direct, but like what is he doing right now that makes Amazon work? Right? You can see the fear that comes from that unification in the history of the labor movement in the United States. Groups like the Pinkertons, right, were levied against organizers to attack them physically. Like, I mean, billy clubs, guns, you name it. We're now seeing Starbucks employees being confronted by those same Pinkertons, right? Because they're asking for better wages, better benefits, better working conditions, right? You can see how the idea of talking to each other is instantly suppressed by both sides, by people in the trenches on both sides, right? It's difficult to talk to people and ask them where they get their ideas from because they don't want to tell you because they think you're going to ridicule them. Daily, we ask people, where did this idea come from? Show me where you're learning this. Not because we want to attack the source, but because we want to know. And we want to be able to say, look at who this is produced by. Look at who this is created by. Do you see that the only point in this is to create a wedge between us? Now, let's go back to the image. And that's a big part of why I decided to talk about all this today. Creating an image and creating art that's meant to confront, that's meant to get a reaction, to get a rise out of people, is often an exercise in what is dramatic, right? So this image is very dramatic. Hanging person in a Klan's hood, people taking pictures. What makes it dramatic isn't the Klan's person. It isn't the people taking pictures. It's tied to history. At least to me, this is what made it dramatic and what made it an important image to me. People are very upset to see it. They say it's hate breeding hate, right? That we hate X group, all white people, right? Not my intention. Be hard for me to hate all white people, as I am married to one and my children are all part white. It's hard to hate all white people because white is a randomized designation based on melanin in your skin that really has no true culture, right? There's not a white culture. There is Italian culture, an Irish culture. You could even say European culture, but European culture is certainly not fully white because Europe has lots of melanated people in it, and their culture has a lot of melanated history, right? To attack a symbol in art, to attack a group that has advocated for violent action against certain races of people, to attack an image elicits emotion in people. And the emotion a lot of the time is really telling. Some people want to double down on it. Yeah, put hanging Nazis to, I'm all for this. I'm not all for that. I don't want to see people get lynched. But I do think it's important to look at this institution and say, this is what they advocated. What happens if the shoe's on the other foot? The response can often be telling. There's people that like to say whites are the only group of people that can't organize, behind their race and create, power for themselves. I would agree with that. I would also agree that black people are allowed to do that more freely. And I think there's a very distinct reason for that. Is because in the United States, black culture is very distinct from white culture in the sense that white culture is a creation of the American system, right? Black culture was forced on black people as a race through the American system. People that have immigrated to the United States from Europe now and in the past, they continue to be Italian, Irish, German, English. They know those things. They know where they came from. Like, how many people love to tell you on St. Patrick's Day that they're Irish? Not just because it's St. Patrick's Day, but because they're part Irish. And they can trace their ancestry. They can look at a genealogy and say, this is where I come from. This is where my people come from. Unfortunately, for the vast majority of black people in the United States, there is no origin story, right? They can trace it back to 1800s, 1700s. This is when my ancestors were purchased, right? Black culture has had to develop itself. It has had to become black culture in the United States because there is no there's no before, right? I have a very similar issue. Being adopted, I don't know who my birth father is. So I have to poke and guess and try to figure out what my heritage looks like, what my ancestry looks like. If you can only trace your family back to when your ancestors were brought over on a slave ship, you're doing the same thing. You're hunting, you're pecking, you're latching on to things that feel appropriate to you. But many of those people can't even trace what part of Africa, what country their ancestors came from. Black culture had to make itself because otherwise it was an empty hole. And nobody lives that way. Nobody wants to live that way with no history, no culture, no past. That lack of a history, that lack of a past, that creation of culture is the exact same thing that's used to drive that wedge. Because if there's a black thing, there has to be a white version, right? So here's black culture creating itself, molding itself, molding American culture, like in profound ways. Like it's almost impossible to find any kind of popular music or media that isn't highly steeped in the created culture of Black America, right? But to combat that, white culture feels left out. You know, they feel the need to create their own version of this, a unified whiteness. But there is no unified whiteness because you can trace your history. You can say, I'm Irish, I'm Italian, I'm this, I'm that. You have a culture, you have something already developed, you have something in place already. You see those same divides with immigrant communities. Here in where I live, there's a big Somalian community. Those people are Somalian, right? They don't embrace Black American culture a lot of the time. They think it's weird because it's not from where they're from, right? They still are Somalian. They have access to their cultural history. They can tell you all about it. So while white culture is being developed, it's pushing aside real history and it's creating a new one, right? There can't be a unified white culture without a unified white history. And that's where you get this rewriting of the textbooks, the mint julep history, the lost cause of the Confederacy, and the never-ending civil war in the United States between people in power and the poor. And their need to divide us so that we can't do better for ourselves. Because if we do better for ourselves, if we find ways to work together, then we'll quickly see that the real people that are exploiting us aren't from the opposite race. They're from a higher economic class. It makes me sad, I guess, to see the comments and to see people that view it as some kind of personal attack, which I think is really interesting. People that view it as a ad hominem against like them, you know, like somehow a picture I drew without knowing you at all as a human being is directed at you. If you're putting that kind of emphasis into art, it says so much more about you than it does about the image. It made me pretty hopeless. I'm not gonna lie. You know, I spent a lot of my life bucking against this. You know, street fighting against Nazis as a teenager. You know, proudly being anti-fascist my whole life. Understanding that Nazism, that, you know, this notion that any kind of race is superior to another race is an invalid notion. Like my whole life I've been steeped in that. I think a lot of that is born out of my mom's history degree. She had a degree in history with a focus in World War II and Holocaust studies. So my house had books about the Holocaust in it, and I was exposed to that kind of imagery and those kind of ideas. And seeing the kind of chaos and death that racial hatred causes has always really bothered me, especially growing up in middle school and high school in the Christian education system and finding myself, you know, at my wit's end as a Latino. Like at the time I thought I was Mexican, turns out I'm actually part Guatemalan. But as a Latino, like being confronted with passive racism, you know, of course you're bigger and stronger, you know, you're a minority, you know, of course you're so smart for a Mexican kid, those kind of statements. Seeing that and then trying to reconcile it with my, at the time, Christian conservative beliefs was very difficult. But I managed to do it. I managed to swallow a lot of my pride in my heritage and to assume that it was more important for me to embrace the white side of me. to the point where I was actually fairly racist, fairly nasty little kid, you know. But as time goes on, I realize that there's so much more behind those racial divisions than race. There's a whole system, a whole structure that's designed to keep people that are generating wealth for the wealthy from realizing the strength that they have as a group. To be able to stand up and say, as people, as the people that are creating the value that this country has, we deserve those benefits. America is exceptional. They have been exceptional at maintaining a system where the government gives no benefit to the population, or very little benefit to the population, while still amassing power and maintaining control. I don't think that's going to last much longer. I'm afraid of how that is going to play out, and I'm afraid of what people think winning might look like. Because if we allow this kind of battle to be fought along racial lines, along religious lines, along, weird social lines, that we will find ourselves in a worse position. Because if power can maintain not just economic power, but a type of social power where they can say, our social structure is also the only correct way. Not only is our economic structure the only way, our social structure is the only way. Then they can create a system that eliminates people that just they don't want. And that will be of no benefit to our country. I didn't really talk much about news, I don't think, or history even. I think this was largely opinion this week. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. Digging deeper is about trying to dig deeper, and sometimes that means digging deeper into myself, not just into politics, into religion. I'll probably return to the format next week. I just want you guys to really think. Really take the time to think about why certain images, why certain ideas, why certain concepts offend you, are being banned, are considered wrong. What voice is trying to be silenced in these situations, and who's trying to silence it? Right? If the white voice is trying to be silenced by someone, who's trying to silence it? If the black voice is trying to be silenced, who's trying to silence it? And I don't mean conservative or liberal. I mean what is actually at the root of it. And I think you'll find that more often than not, that root goes right back to people that can throw $1 million at an idea. They can throw $1 million at a politician and say, do this thing. They can throw $1 million at an organization and say, you need to say this. Our problem in our country isn't race. Our problem in this country isn't political parties. Our problem in this country isn't women's rights or gay rights or anything. Our problem in this country is born of a group of people that refuse to let go of power to the people that they are intended to represent. And the steps that this country has taken to entrench those people in the positions of power can be seen from all the similar last names. You know, Joe Biden's almost 80 and has been in office for 35 years. And he has passed some incredibly racist legislation and has made some incredibly boneheaded moves. You know, the Clintons, the Bushes, the Cheneys. You know, these are all dynasties of politicians. That is exactly what we were not supposed to be. We'll see. We'll see how it goes, but I just don't anticipate it being tenable much longer. And I hope that we can find solutions that don't involve people getting lynched, right? That don't involve putting the shoe on the other foot or putting people in harm's way. I hope that we can get there, but it's going to start with people of all types advocating for their right to be at the table, to be discussing within the halls of power. Take action. Actually participate in your democracy. And I don't just mean go vote, because go vote is not the kind of action call that our country needs. The kind of action call that our country needs is run for office, right? That's ideologues that are suppressing information. That's exactly what they did. They saw an opportunity to use that space to their advantage, to support a system that wants to continue to oppress all people, to create more divides within our nation in the name of preventing CRT or stopping white supremacy, right? Be on boards. Participate in your community's democracy. Your voice deserves to be heard just like everyone else's, and your voice should advocate for people being presented not just with options, but also with the ability to survive effectively. We need to take the time to realize that these political, religious, social divisions are created so that we don't understand that our government refuses to benefit us, which should be the only purpose of government, is to provide benefit to the citizenry, right? What is your government doing for you? And if it's not doing what you want it to do, go become it, all right? And don't get conned by the money game. Just go and be. I don't know. That was pretty rambly. I hope it makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know in the comments. If you have issues with what I say, I'd love to hear it. If you have agreement, if you have ideas, we'd love to hear it. Please feel free to reach out to us on all of our social media. If you get a chance, shoot us an email, shoot us a message. We like to talk with people. That's the whole point, is to engage in conversation. Like, we try really hard not to attack people. We try really hard to ask people where their ideas came from. One of the best things that happened this week was, in the midst of being called a million names and having unfactual ideas presented without evidence, one person messaged and said, I was invited to like your page. I laughed at the image. Could you tell me a little bit about your company and what it means on the political, social and religious spectrum? And I explained it. And instead of calling me a douchebag or an idiot or a moron or, a homo or whatever, the guy said, I don't think that I'm a great fit for you as a customer because I tend to lean in the opposite direction, but thank you for telling me about your cooperative. What? A rational conversation. Best part of my week by far. So please, come have some rational conversations with us. We'd love to talk to you. While you're at it, hit the subscribe button, like this video, hit the bell notification and go to always so that you don't miss an episode. It's been a week, and it'll be another week next week. Until next time, just remember, I'm Gabe, Spitefilled Clothing Cooperative, spitefilled.coop. Take you right there. Think at all costs, guys.
I don't wanna be loved by you, be loved by you. I don't need to be hurt or rescued, not by you.